everyone. Now, in this lesson, we're going to get to grips with how well China have actually been delivering on their reform process. Now, some of the reforms have been implemented in a very disappointing fashion. We'll come to that in a moment. But the key principles that we must remember before we get into the nuts and bolts of this is really that China is undertaking these reforms under the mechanism of a gradualist transition to more of a mixed economy. So it's really important to remember that all of these reforms are intended to be implemented in a very cautionary, very gradual process. Further to that, if we consider Xi Jinping, of course, he is known as a modernizer for China, but not necessarily a reformer. So what does that mean? Well, it means really, in essence, that he's quite traditional in his views, but realizes that China does need to modernize their economy. Nevertheless, he believes in socialism, he believes in the Communist Party, and is arguably a massive advocate in favour of communism, what with his slogan of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Okay, so let's take a look at what we've got here. Now, I've used this information that I've gathered here from the Asia Society's excellent China dashboard, which I really suggest that you have a look at with regard to your research on this China and the global economy theme. Now, it gives updates on progress on each of the different categories of reforms, and it uses various indicators as a means to actually determine how well performance is being gathered towards fulfilling those stated aims. Okay, so yeah, it indicates that progress in 2 out of 10 categories was positive. So meaning that the other 8 categories were either neutral or there was actually some degree of backsliding or negative process in place. Okay, so let's deal with the positives firstly. Now, the one that really stood out in the reports that they've issued on the winter 2018 results was innovation. So Chinese firms are getting much better at innovating, and this is well supported by the Chinese government. So the state is pushing this really quite nicely, and this is encouraging that much more innovation. However, there is a negative when it comes to this though, and that is really in the fact that there is a certain degree of favouring towards the domestic based firms. Now, of course, that means for foreign firms it makes the competitive market and the competitive environment that much more difficult for them to operate in, and can of course act as a form of protectionism. Okay, so that's the downside, and we can see right over here one of the areas actually where there is a bit of a regression there. Okay, and that is in the competition, the degree of competition within China's markets. Okay, this is particularly aggravated as well by the lack of reform to intellectual property rights and lack of enforcement that's taking place there. And of course, without patents, without those sorts of IP protections, it means that firms don't have the right incentives to actually want to innovate further. Okay, so it's really important to actually offer those incentives towards further research and development and innovation, and that may be granted towards Chinese firms, but less so when it comes to foreign firms. Okay, so further to that, we can also see that environment is still slightly towards the progress side of things as well, and that there has been some measurable difference in air quality and yeah, water quality as well. So that's clearly good news, and that there is a real attempt to actually generate further green development, of course, within the Chinese economy. Finance, we've got neutral progress there apparently. So of course, without further progress here, the allocation of capital will not be improved in the Chinese economy, and that may reduce the allocative efficiency of the finance sector. Okay, so that may hold back startup firms and firms that need access to greater sources of finance, because so-called zombie firms might still be kept in still be kept alive, so to speak. Okay, moving on, we've got a little bit of backsliding when it comes to land, and that land reforms aren't making sufficient progress. So areas for concern here include rural land, and the fact that yeah, most rural land is collectivized and then divided up between individual farms. Now this means that for those farmers, they can only sell their land back to the state, and they can't sell it at market determined prices. So as a consequence of this, it means that the state has, of course, a vested interest in ensuring that they get a good price for it, but they also want to make good profits from whatever land they're actually selling. So as a result of this, it means that for rural people, they can't necessarily just sell their land, get a good price for it, and migrate to the cities. Further to that, it also means that the farms can't actually become that much larger and increase their economies of scale. So it means most farms are actually very, very small in size, and of course their technology and their productivity is very low as a result of that. Okay. Furthermore, we've got neutral progress within SOEs and trade SOEs. For instance, I know the Chinese government is really pushing regional provinces to actually determine which SOEs should belong to firmly in the state sector, which ones should be made up of a mixed ownership based structure, and which ones should be allowed to actually move towards the private sector, or alternatively shut down altogether. And of course, the decentralised method of government is meant to incentivise the process by which that occurs. But obviously, progress very, very slow here, as it is with regard to trade and also investment. So, you know, a lot of frustration here among foreign firms, not to mention with the competitive environment that they face that we've already mentioned there. The investment hasn't been liberalised to the extent that they would like it. It isn't as easy to trade in China as perhaps they'd like it to be. Furthermore, we see further backsliding with regard to the fiscal reforms that are necessary within China. So, for instance, what we have here is that Beijing may say one thing, but the actual regions, the provinces may actually determine that actually with their budgets they're going to do this and they are going to overspend. So the heavily decentralized system of government in China does mean that there are large fiscal imbalances within certain provinces, and of course that is a potential area for concern. Okay. Finally, we've got the labour reforms now. This is one of the certain indicators here that was used in this data in putting together this report is the wage growth that just isn't occurring for rural migrants. And I think there's been 6 consecutive quarters of real wage falls for those migrant workers. So those migrant workers still aren't getting a good deal. They're still not necessarily protected by some sort of minimum wage legislation. They're not being allowed to actually share in the gains and the profits that are being made by many urban firms that are actually doing very, very well for themselves. So that's an area for concern, because of course that breeds inequality. Okay, and there is also concerns about the limits of progress that have been made in terms of the reform of the hukou system, meaning that of course migrant workers might not be entitled to certain public services. Okay, so that's really it in a nutshell. What I suggest you do from this is really have a look at possibly 3 areas of this report. Just have a look for Asian Society China dashboard. Perhaps have a look at the labour or competition, and yeah, the land's an interesting one, as are these 2 areas, in fact. So possibly have a look at 3 different sectors in detail and just get to know what's actually taking place there, or what isn't taking place, and just try to understand this information in a little bit more detail. Okay, of course, ask if you've got any questions, but that's it, guys. Thank you.